Diablo 4 is just 1 week away, and I could not be more hype. In the weeks leading up to Diablo 4, I've been planning out my approach for server launch and wanted to share the things that I've learned and seen to help out anyone else playing Rogue on server launch. In this video, I'm going to cover 3 build options for launch, with context for the levels of strength and when I'm going to run them, dungeons and areas to hit along the way, and finally, some general leveling tips and strategies. With that out of the way, let me get into the builds. So for the build that I'm going to be running right on server launch, it's going to be focused around Flurry. And you might not expect that because most people are going to tell you to go Twisting Blades, and I'll go through my reasoning here. So the first reason that I think the Flurry build is going to be really nice right away is because you can get the aspect of Encircling Blades right away. It's in one of the dungeons right below the first main city in Act 1, so you can get this right away. And it's going to increase your Flurry damage really substantially. So I think this is going to be a nice complement to make this build feel really strong up until the early 20s. The reason I'm running this build right away is because with all the testing I did with the Twisting Blades build, it feels a bit more dependent on items and your stats, so you definitely want to make sure you have some things rolling before that build really hits its power spike. Again, you could run it from level 1 to 20 and be just fine. I'm a little min-maxer, and I think this build's going to be a bit stronger, so this is my plan to run right away. But to go through the build, if you want to follow me, I'm going to be going with Invigorating Strike and getting Fundamental to apply the initial vulnerable. And then I'm going to be capping out Flurry for the damage, and then going with Improved Flurry because we want to spread that vulnerable. And with the aspect of Encircling Blades, because it makes it so Flurry is a full circle around you, you're basically spreading vulnerable to any enemy within the range of Flurry. Now, I do want to mention that if you saw Flurry gameplay in the beta, you probably will note that this aspect wasn't working as intended. There seemed to be like some weird hitboxes. I'm faithful that Blizzard's going to fix that. If they don't, I don't think it's going to cripple this build too much. And again, I'm only running this until level 20 anyways, so it's not going to be a big deal. So we're going to go for this, and then right when we get down here, we're going to take Dash, and we're just going to take Enhanced Dash for that crit chance. And Dash synergizes really well with this build because you want to be up in enemies' faces, and you want to keep your uptime up. So having that mobility is really nice. And then when it comes to uptime as well, we have Dark Shroud. So Dark Shroud's just a really nice defensive, and then when you take Countering Dark Shroud, it's a nice offensive as well. The crit chance is really nice. And then finally for our imbuement, we're going to take Shadow Imbuement with Blended Shadow Imbuement. But right when I get around level 24, level 22, this is where I'm going to swap to the second build, and this makes a great segue into build number 2. So for the second build, surprise, surprise, we're going with Twisting Blades. The reason that I'm waiting to go this build is because these aspects you can get to make this build really strong, especially Blade Dancers, come in Act 2. So my theory is by the time I'm high 20s, mid 20s, I will be in Act 2, based on my strategy that I'll talk about a little bit later in the video. And it'll make this build a lot stronger, because I personally do believe that Flurry all the way up until the mid 20s is still a very viable option. But anyway, with that all out of the way, let's actually go through the build. So starting off with the basic skills, we have Puncture, and we're going to take Fundamental Puncture. As I talked about with the other build, Vulnerable is a great debuff, and it also synergizes really well with the passive we're going to run with this build, but I'll talk about that later. Moving into the core skills, we're obviously going to be running Twisting Blades, and we're going to take Advanced Twisting Blades because this passive makes it so your cooldowns are resetting constantly, and it's really powerful in actual practice. Moving into the agility section, I'm personally going to run Shadow Step because I value having the Unstoppable to get out of CC. Some people might want to run Dash with this build. It's completely up to you. It's all preference-based. For me, in the server slam, I noticed the only times I was dying or getting near death was when I was in CC. So having Unstoppable like Shadow Step or Concealment, which we'll run in the other build, is a really nice thing to have. And before we move on from the agility section, I also want to mention that Weapon Mastery is especially good if you have swords. That 9% flat increased damage is very noticeable and substantial, so consider taking that if you're running swords. So the Subterfuge section is where my build is a little bit different from a lot of the builds I've been seeing. The build that I'm running here is going to utilize Poison Trap instead of using Shadow Clone. I very well may switch to Shadow Clone when I get to test in-game, but I tried this build in the server slam, and I saw a lot of success with it, especially with countering Poison Trap. The main appeal of countering Poison Trap is the fact that it has a 30% chance to reset your imbuement cooldown, and the reason that's really good is because Shadow Imbuement is a huge amplifier for all your damage, and it also is a big source of your vulnerable, which synergizes with the passive, so the more uptime we have on this ability, the higher damage we have. But again, like I said, it's a build that I got to test in the server slam. Again, Shadow Clone may be better when we actually have all of our skill points and the Paragon synergies, but we just don't know yet from testing. And then for the other ability we're going to run in Subterfuge, we're going to take Dark Shroud again, similar to the first build, and we're going to take Countering Dark Shroud for the crit chance. And as I mentioned before with the Imbuement, we're going to do Shadow Imbuement with the same Blended Shadow Imbuement for the vulnerable. And for our ultimate, like I said, we can't run an ultimate because we have 4 skills. We have Shadow Imbuement, we have Poison Trap, Dark Shroud, and we have Shadow Step. So I'm not going to take an ultimate skill. I'm going to take Trap Mastery to give my Poison Trap a little bit more damage. And then I'm also going to take Adrenaline Rush and Haste just for the quality of life with my energy. And then finally for the passive, I'm going to take Victimize because it synergizes really well with this build with the amount of vulnerable you're putting out consistently. And it's a really nice passive to kind of seal the build. But that's about it for build 2. And then for the third build option, I'm going to go through this really quickly. This is a ranged option for anyone that wants to get back into their D3 roots with the Demon Hunter, feeling like you have a ranged build and a ranged option. I wanted to give my thoughts on an early ranged build you could do for launch. So getting into it, there's 2 aspects you're going to want for this build that are pretty important. They do both come after Act 1, I believe. I forget where this aspect is, actually, and it doesn't say here, but I know this is in Act 2. But these are 2 aspects that are really important for the build. I'm not going to go into too many specifics around it. I haven't gotten to test it, but these are what people are theory crafting around this build. Then for our spec, we're going to go with Preparation because this build does use Rain of Arrows, but we'll get into that. So let's go into the skill tree. Moving into the skill tree, we're going to start with Heartseeker, and we're going to go for Fundamental Heartseeker for the crit. Then for our core skill, we're going to go into Penetrating Shot. Now, I know there's a big toss-up between Rapid Fire and Penetrating Shot. For my money, with my testing in the Server Slam, Penetrating Shot felt like a really good option. Also felt like more consistent boss damage. But again, up to you. You could go with either. If you're going to go the Rapid Fire build, you probably should not follow this path because I think this does go a few different things. But anyway, if you're going with the Penetrating Shot build, you're going to go with Improved Penetrating Shot for the crit. And then we're going to take Stutter Step before we get out of here because the movement speed is really nice for a range class. Then when it comes into the agility section, I'm actually going to skip agility skills, but I do want to make an honorable mention here. If you are running this build, you absolutely can go Shadow Step, but I got to test Concealment in the Server Slam, and it feels like a really nice option for this range build. You basically get to reposition, but there is a conversation to be had around Shadow Step if you are running a Poison Trap variant of this build, because you can basically Shadow Step in, drop your Poison Trap, and you're kind of a more fast-paced, offensive, ranged melee hybrid kind of thing, and it's kind of cool. But anyway, I'm not going to get too much into that. I'm going to take Concealment, and I'm going to take Subverting Concealment. The reason for this is because with Concealment, it's nice to have the Unstoppable. This is what I really like about it, and then you can reposition while you're in stealth. Then we take Subverting because of the vulnerable it applies. And then for our imbuement, surprise, surprise, we're going to go with Shadow Imbuement, but this time we're not going to take Blended. We're actually going to take Mixed because we want to increase our non-physical damage because we have a lot of synergy with that. Now, I didn't get to play with this in the Server Slam because my gear wasn't good enough, but I am theory crafting that this Rain of Arrows build is going to be really good, especially when you get to spec into prep. And then you want to get both the enhancements for it. And finally, when we go into our passive, we're going to go with Precision. So these are some options you can consider if you're a range build. Again, this build, I want to be completely upfront and honest. This is probably the build I tested the least, but I wanted to give an option for range builds if you didn't have any before. I'm also going to share all these builds with you in the description, so if you want to follow along or have these on a second monitor when launch comes out, feel free to do so. But anyway, let's move into the next section. So for the areas to hit along the way, I want to keep this pretty simple. The first thing you want to hit is the dungeon right above the main city with the flurry aspect that I showed before. Then on top of that, you're going to want to do almost any event you see. Obols are going to be a big deal. It's basically Diablo 4's version of Kadala, if you remember from Diablo 3. And finally, if you are playing Rogue, or even if you're not playing Rogue, stop by any dungeon you see that has an aspect for the main build that you're running. Now, I know that was a really quick mention of the areas to hit, and the reason is because I want to talk a lot more about the main strategy. So the first thing I want to mention when it comes to strategy is you should start your Diablo 4 launch on World Tier 1. I definitely did not find this out myself, and I don't want to take credit, so if you want to know more about the reasons why, check out this video in the description or in the cards above. But with that out of the way, my personal plan for approach in terms of leveling is pretty simple. I'm going to do the main campaign all the way until I unlock Mount Riding. Mounts are going to speed up your general traversal around the world, and it makes the most sense to go back and do more of the side quests and general world content when you have them unlocked. It's also worth noting that you're going to want to get your specialization unlocked as soon as possible, and to do this for Rogue, you're going to need to go to Menestad and start the quest there. This is something you'll want to do as early as possible because it's going to give you a lot of extra power to clear dungeons and other content as quickly as possible to speed up your leveling process. To condense all of this down for you in a really digestible, understandable way, here's the bullet points. First, play on World Tier 1 until you unlock World Tier 3. Next, get your specialization as early as possible. Then, unlock Mount Riding and start doing side quests because you're gonna need to do these later into the endgame anyway for zone completion. For my final tip, make sure your character is as strong as possible. When it comes to leveling, and hopefully this is really obvious, you want to be as strong as possible to clear content as quickly as possible to ensure leveling speed is maximized. Hopefully this video has helped you out and given you some ideas to kickstart your Diablo 4 launch experience. Anyway, my name has been Valued, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to sub to the channel because I'm going to be releasing a ton of builds, guides, tips, and similar content to what you've seen today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.